on Daf Chaf Beis Amud Beis. We're on page 22b, and we've been discussing the laws of a sukkah that has schach at different levels of height, different heights of the schach. It starts at one area in the sukkah, the schach is lower, another area it's higher, and we finally finished that whole sugya, this whole discussion, which took basically a it took 2 pages of the Gemara, and we got involved learning about Oyalois, the laws of Oyhel, a tent. We also learned about Eruv, the laws of Eruv, and we learned about this special law called Chavoit Rami. And we saw Rashi and Tosfos. We saw different views over here, and ultimately the conclusion of the Gemara was that there are times when you can say Chavoit Rami, and the main rule that we saw is that as long as the upper schach has a tefach, then it's big enough to be considered significant that we could use this rule of Chavoit Rami, and we could lower the upper schach and let it be considered flush and equal level with the other schach. And that's basically the Gemara. The interesting thing is that the Gemara calls this a sukkah meduvlelis, and we did have an argument about what it actually means. We had an argument between Rav and Shmuel. Now, who does the halacha normally follow when you have an argument between Rav and Shmuel? The halacha, it depends. When it comes to monetary laws, we normally follow Shmuel. In the halacha, when it comes to laws of what's kosher and what's not, what's permitted and what's not, the law normally follows Rav. Here, who does the halacha follow? It's talking about a sukkah meduvlelis, and we had an argument between Rav and Shmuel what that means. And so Rav says one meaning, Shmuel says another meaning. So who does the halacha follow? And the Gemara's big discussion seems to be discussing Shmuel. It doesn't really talk much about Rav's interpretation. Rav's case, it seems more, Rav's law seems more simple, and the Gemara doesn't really talk about it much. Shmuel's understanding, the Gemara has 2 pages about, and it ultimately leads us into this Chavoit Rami, this special law that we learned here on page 22 in Sukkah, which we didn't have until now, this special law that you could lower something that's above and imagine something that's higher could be considered lower. So we went through a whole 2 pages about it. But Rav, the Gemara doesn't seem to discuss much. So because of that, what we see here, it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch, this law Sukkah meduvlelis, we saw it yesterday in the Shulchan Aruch. What we see is that even though normally the halacha would follow Rav and not Shmuel, when it comes to these type of laws of sukkah, it's not a monetary issue. It's a law of iser veheter. It's called law of what's permissible and what's not permissible. So normally we would follow Rav. The reason why we follow Rav in these type of laws and not Shmuel, and we follow laws of Shmuel when it comes to monetary laws and not Rav, is the simple understanding is Rav was considered an expert in a specialist in laws of Isser Veheter, and Shmuel was considered an expert or specialist in monetary laws. So the question is, so why here are we paskening? As we see in Shulchan Aruch, they seem to bring this Gemara's discussion of Sukkah Meduvlelas, which is really Shmuel, and we're not really supposed to follow Shmuel. So it seems for two reasons. The reason why we're going to follow Shmuel here is two reasons. One is that it could be Rav doesn't argue on Shmuel. Rav is just explaining what the meaning of the Mishnah is, but the actual law of Shmuel can't really argue on. It's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This is a law given to Moses at Sinai called Chavoit Rami. So you can't really argue on it. So therefore, there's reason to paskin like Shmuel also. No, it's not saying we don't paskin like Rav. We also paskin like Shmuel here because it's not, no one argues. Even Rav doesn't really argue, just arguing about the meaning of the Mishnah, but they're not arguing in law. Another point is, and this is similar to something we found on the previous page of the Gemara, and that is that when the Gemara takes and dissects a opinion, that is a sign that we follow that view. The Gemara takes 2 pages to talk about Shmuel here. This is a sign that we're supposed to paskin like Shmuel. We're supposed to follow the final verdict should follow Shmuel. So that's another reason, because it's called the shakel vatari, the shakla vataria, the back and forth, the debate, the dialogue that the Gemara goes through with regard to Shmuel's law. So that would be another reason why Shulchan Aruch follows Shmuel. Yes, David.
I thought of another reason is because maybe you want to buy your sukkah from somebody or sell your sukkah to somebody. So it would be under the laws of buying and selling.
So that sounds nice. The only thing is that you're taking it a little too far. Everything could be considered monetary laws. You know what I mean? You could make everything into a monetary law, and and say, oh, we have to follow Shmuel because it's monetary. It's not really a monetary law. You're just extending it into you're manipulating it and making it into a monetary. There's not really a monetary law here. This is a question if it's a kosher sukkah or not. It's not a monetary law means that if it's a question of who owns something, ownership or inheritance, things like that. Those are monetary laws. Acquisition. This would not fall into that category, even if you sold it and so on. Okay, so we've got the.
What's that? Yes, I did.
1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have the Gemara pretty much we've gone over, and then we started a new piece yesterday. V'shatsilsa meruba mechamasa ksheira. So we're gonna let's start with that piece again. Chechamasa meruba mitzilasa. This is on page 22b, and
22b3.
So you have an art scroll Gemara, and there in the art scroll there's like a few 22b's. There's a 22b1, a 22b2, 22b3, maybe even a b4. I don't have that Gemara in front of me, so although I do own one, but I don't have it, and therefore I'm not 100% sure. We're gonna try to help you out, figure out where it is, where we are. But let me tell you, in the Hebrew, we are starting from Vishetsilsa Meruba Mechamasa, which is about 20 lines from the top of the page. Let's see, 5, 10, 15, 20, no, about 30 lines from the top of the page. maybe 20, somewhere around between 25 and 30 lines from the top of the page. So V'shetzilsa meruba mechamos, it would start a new paragraph, and it's going to be talking about the Mishnah's statement. I would guess it's about B3, but again, it's you'll have to figure it out and keep track where we are afterwards, because I don't announce normally the art scroll page number because I don't have it. I don't normally use it.
Okay, thank you.
Did you find it? We're talking about that there's more shade than sunlight.
Well, the page I'm on,
Hmm?
all right, the page I'm on begins with the Mishnah.
Which Mishnah? What does it start with? What does the Mishnah say? Ha'isa sukasa, if a person
If one
makes
makes a sukkah on the top of a wagon.
Okay, so we're on the page before that. So it's B2.
Okay, thank you.
22B2. And it's probably starting a new paragraph, and it's probably not too far away from the end of the page. So it's Vishatsilsa Meruba
Okay,
Mechamasa,
very good.
when the shade is more than the sunlight. Kshera, it is kosher. And that was a statement in our Mishnah. And the Gemara asked a question, Ha ki hadadi psula. However, if the shade is equal, it's not more than the sunlight, but it's equal to the sunlight. And again, we're talking about a sukkah that has equal shade and sunlight. So it implies, because the Mishnah said if it has more shade than sunlight, it's kosher. That implies that if it has equal, it's not kosher. More sun, more shade, then it's kosher. Equal shade and sunlight sounds like it's not kosher. The Gemara asks, for Hatanan, didn't we learn Bidach Pirkin in the other chapter? The other chapter means the previous chapter, the first Mishnah, V'shechamsa meruba mitzilasa, when you have the chama, the sun, more than the shade, it says psula, it's invalid. Oh, if it's more sunlight than shade, it's invalid. Then what does that imply? If it was equal, haki hadadi, but if it would be the same, like each other, they would be equal, keshera, then it'll be kosher. More sunlight is invalid. But if it's equal, then it's kosher. So our Mishnah implies if it's equal, it's invalid. That Mishnah of the first chapter implies that if it's equal, it's valid. So how do you reconcile this contradiction? The Gemara answers, like kasha, it's not a kasha. Kan milamaila, kan milamata. Here we're talking about milmaila, above, and here we're talking about below. Now, what does this mean? Here we're talking about above, and here we're talking about below. So we have Rashi's interpretation. Rashi on the side tells us that when it says, or when it implies that it's going to be invalid when they're equal, that's talking about when it's equal shade and sunlight. When you have equal shade and equal sunlight above by the schach, by the actual layer of the covering for your sukkah, and at that point it's exactly equal. Even if it's exact, it's going to be invalid because the sunlight is going to extend into the sukkah, and ultimately it's going to be more than the shade within the sukkah, and therefore equal schach in sunlight is invalid. Now, when is it kosher if it's equal? That is when inside the sukkah there's equal shade and sunlight, which would basically mean that, let's say, in half of your sukkah you see clearly as shade, and half of your sukkah you see clearly as sunlight. Then obviously above, it must be that there's more schach, there's more branches than empty space. And because of that, it is going to be a kosher sukkah, even though in the sukkah it's only half and half, but above it's going to be more shade than sunlight, more schach, more branches than sunlight. and that's going to be kosher. So ultimately, what it boils down to is that your sukkah itself needs to be at least half and half, and the actual shade of the branches have to be more than the empty space, a little more than half. And as long as it's a little over the halfway point, then it should be a kosher sukkah. And so whenever it implies like half and half is invalid, half and half is invalid when it's talking about the schach on the top. The actual layer can't be half and half. It has to be more than half. And when we talk about half and half being kosher, that's when we talk about the shade in the sukkah itself on the floor of the sukkah. That's where half and half is kosher. So you got half and halves that are not kosher, and you have half and halves that are kosher. The half and half is not kosher if it's the schach. The half and half that is kosher is if it's the floor of the sukkah. The floor of the sukkah, there half and half would be kosher. Now, that was the interpretation. That was the interpretation of Rashi. Now, the Gemara continues and it says, Amar Rav Papa. So Rav Papa says, that Hainu de Imri Inchi. This is what people say. This is a term, like it's like a known saying that people say that kizuza milael, when you have a coin, which is a zuz is a type of coin, milael, which means above, it is kiistera miltachas. It's seen as much larger below. If there's a small hole on the roof, the size of a zuz, or on the schach of a sukkah, so it'll be a bigger area, like the size of an istera, a different coin, or sela, which is bigger than a zuz, that will be below. So basically, you have something which obviously, it seems logical. If you have the sunlight shooting into your sukkah, so if there's a small hole that it's shooting in from, it's going to extend and expand as it gets closer to the floor of the sukkah. Now,
but what's in the physics here, we're getting a little
is
physics,
it not
light refraction. We're learning about.
Is this your field?
Well, no, engineering, but we had to study that. But yeah, we're seeing that there's no subject that the Gemara
Doesn't cover.
that we're aware of.
Okay. Now, there is discussion here, of course, among the commentaries, which one of the main commentaries here is Tosfos, and he doesn't like this understanding. He says that there's a problem here because he says the coins are not exactly correct. The coin size. He has a proof that the coin sizes are different. Istera is smaller than a zuz. Now that sort of messes up this interpretation. And he also has another problem, and he says that there's a debate in the laws of Shabbos. When you have a wall around an area, but it has holes, there are breaches in the wall. So there is a rule that what is the majority? Is it majority solid, or is there majority empty spaces? And there's an argument when it's half and half. Rav Papa and another rabbi debate what happens when you have half and half. And Rav Papa is lenient. He says, as long as it's half and half, it's still called a wall. You have half empty space and half solid. It's considered a wall. It's called parutz. Is ka'oimed. That we look at the empty space as if it's solid. Why? Because only if it's majority empty space is that a problem. If it's half and half, it's not a problem. Now think about that in terms of schach. Imagine you have schach on your sukkah, and you have half and half empty space, half branches. It's exact. What should the halacha be? What should the law be? Is that a kosher sukkah or not? So we just talked about Rashi's view, the way Rashi understands the Gemara. Again, Rashi doesn't just decide what he wants. He's explaining the words of the Gemara, and it comes out that according to his explanation, this would be the halacha that our Gemara presents. Now, if you learn the Gemara differently, then you would end up coming out with a different halacha. But the way Rashi understood the Gemara comes out that the Gemara is paskening one way. How does the Gemara pasken? What is the verdict of the Gemara when you have branches and empty space covering your sukkah, and it's exactly half and half? So Rashi came up with a problem. The way Rashi learned the Gemara, he says, there's a problem there. It's not kosher. What was the prize at not kosher? Why is that not a kosher sukkah? So Rashi's understanding was not kosher because the empty space, although on the schach level, it's half and half, but when that empty space, which basically means sunlight, when that expands further into the sukkah, what's going to happen? That's going to ruin the sukkah. So even though on the top you might say it's half and half, but it really ends up being more than half because the expansion of the sunlight. Now Tosfos doesn't seem to be bothered with that. On the contrary, he says we have a law that says harutz ka'omed, something that's breached. If it's half and half, it's like it's solid because it's only half and half. And therefore, the sukkah that's half and half should be considered that it's solid. It should be considered a solid wall of schach if it's exactly half and half. If it's less than half, fine. That's not kosher. But if it's exactly half and half, we have a law from the other laws of Shabbos, harutz ka'omed. So Tosfos says, if that's so, we should say that it's kosher if you have half and half. So he's got these two problems. I mentioned it in the opposite order, but these are the two questions that Tosfos asks. He first asked this question about harutz ka'omed, that when you have half and half, it should be kosher. So he's asking the question on Rashi's interpretation of the Gemara. Rashi understood half and half schach would be kosher, would be invalid because the sunlight is going to expand. And Tosfos says we have a law that it's kosher, so too bad. The sunlight expands, doesn't matter. It's kosher. This is called harutz ka'omed. And then he asked the other question that I mentioned, that he has a source that Istera is like half the size of a zuz. It's basically smaller than a zuz. It doesn't really fit with the poetic words that Rav Papa wanted to say, or some type of line that people say, kazuzah, like that. That can't be the meaning of that. Like kazuzah milael, Istera miltachas. Istera is smaller. Istera is smaller than a zuz, so it doesn't really fit. So therefore, Rabbeinu Tam and Tosfos, therefore, Tosfos has a different interpretation of argument. And he says that when it says milmaila in milmata, when it's above and when it's below, it's not talking about the empty space or the sunlight. It's talking about where you are looking from the vantage point of where you are, that's what the Gemara means. If you're above or below, not if the schach, we're not talking about the empty space is above or the empty space is below, it's where are you? So he says that a person who's measuring it above and he sees that it's half and half, so that would mean that it's kosher because you're having your calculation is a legitimate calculation. You're calculating it from right there, from where the schach is, and it's half and half. And half and half, Taisa says, we have a previous Gemara that tells us that that's kosher. But if a person is standing below and he's looking up, he's putting his head upwards and looking up to the schach, and it seems to him that it's equal, guess what? Taisa says, then it's not kosher. Why? Because the empty space that looks it looks like it's equal, it's really much larger. And the reason it's much larger is because it doesn't look as much larger because it's far from him. And being that it's far from him, it looks smaller. But really, in truth, it's larger. So the space, which is large, like the size of a zuz, it looks to him like an istira. So it's kazuzah milael, what looks to him like a what really is a zuz above, it looks to him ki istira milatachas, and from below it looks like what would be a zuz above is really looking like an istira, which is smaller when you're standing below. When you're standing below, it only looks like an istira because you're far from it. And Tosfos brings a proof to this. He says, we were like grasshoppers in the eyes of the giants. And what does that mean? That the giants are so tall, they looked at us like grasshoppers, but we aren't grasshoppers. But they saw us. They thought we were smaller than we were because we're so far from them, because they're so tall. So something that when you're far away from something, it looks smaller than it really is. And Tosfos also says the same thing is with a star. When you have a keichav gadol, a big star in the heavens, it looks much smaller. So this is Tosfos's interpretation. And what comes out from this is, what is the halacha when you have half branches and half empty space? Exact. According to Rashi, it is invalid. According to Tosfos, if you're measuring it and it's exact, it is kosher. And Tosfos is basing his law on a rule that applies to the laws of Shabbos, which has to do with the laws of a mechitza, a fence. That's the law of a sukkah, that the schach of a sukkah. The laws of a partition is the laws of a schach of a sukkah, that it's parutz is kaimet. So Tosfos would hold that it's kosher, and Rashi would hold that it's not kosher. And again, it boils down to how they translate two words in our Gemara, milamaila or milamata. Kan milmaila, or you could say it's four words in our Gemara. Rashi learns kan milmaila, kan milmata means where is the item that you're looking at? Are you looking at the schach above, or are you looking at the airspace below? That's the way Rashi learned. Tosfos learned, where are you standing when you're measuring? We're measuring the schach. We're not measuring the airspace. But where are you standing? Are you standing above, or are you standing below and looking up, far away from where the schach is? If you're standing below and looking up far away from where the schach is, then really the schach, empty space, your calculation is off. And really it's much larger. But if you actually calculate it physically with a measuring tape, and you see clearly that it's exactly half, then it would actually be kosher, a kosher sukkah. So this is an argument between Rashi and Tosfos.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
When people are learning Gemara in the early stages, they're learning Gemara with just Rashi. They're not learning with Tosfos. So it sounds so once you start learning Tosfos, it sounds like you're missing half of the explanation of the Gemara.
100%. They missed out. And imagine before Rashi, who knows how they could have even gotten through it? Who knows what they, what type of mistakes people might have made if they weren't well educated. Rashi did this is a work beyond imagination. What Rashi did for us, both in Chumash, in Tanakh, and in Gemara. He opened the door for people to be able to even begin, even scholars to be able to enter into the realm of Gemara. And Tosfos is incredible because he adds a whole new dimension to the Gemara. So you're right. Without Tosfos, you're missing half of the half of the Gemara you're missing because you don't see the other side.
It's not only another dimension. It's like if like the way we learn the Chumash with Rashi, and we're learning Chumash with Rashi, and we understand, and along comes Tosfos, and not only it's another dimension that's contradictory to Rashi. A lot of times it's the other side. So can you imagine somebody would come along with a commentary that explains the Chumash totally different than the way we've been learning Chumash with Rashi's explanation.
Well, I mean, we're familiar with that. We have the Ramban, who often argues on Rashi. We've got the Orach Chaim HaKadosh on Chumash. The Ramban, the Orach Chaim, we've got numerous commentaries that give their interpretations that are different than the Ibn Ezra. The Ramban is the most famous to debate Rashi's interpretation, but there are numerous commentaries on Chumash that have other interpretations.
Thanks for clarifying.
Even Rashi's grandson, just like Tosfos is a lot. Tosfos is basically a lot of Rashi's grandchildren were the authors of Tosfos, and Chumash as well. The Rashbam tried to debate his grandfather on Chumash, and often he claims this is more pshutei shel mikra, this is more simple understanding of the Chumash. But of course, the other commentaries as well, the Ramban and the others. Okay, so we've got
Rabbi.
Yes.
We don't pass in halacha according to Rashi or Tosfot.
In this case, or in general?
In general.
So that's an interesting statement. What you mean to say, I think, is that the Shulchan Aruch bases the halacha on the Rambam, on the Rosh, and on the Rif, and therefore Rashi and Tosfos is not exactly the source of the halacha. However, the other Rishonim, like the Rosh, bases his discussion on Rashi and on the Tosfos, and so you can't say that our halacha is not based on Rashi or Tosfos. It's also, if you look in the later, like the Mishnah Berurah, even the Mishnah Berurah, or even the Alter Rebbe, when he decides who we should be machmer like, or we should follow, we could be lenient on, he is basing his law on the fact that Rashi is lenient, or Rashi is more strict. So even though the halacha might follow generally one, but you could find in many times in the Mishnah Berurah where he's going to say, well, in a case of great need, you can rely on Rashi, or you can rely on Tosfos. You can rely on, often Rashi's view and Tosfos's view is brought down in the Torah and in the source of where halacha comes from. So, of course, the Beis Yosef who decides what who's the basis of the Shulchan Aruch. Guess what? Half of the Beis Yosef brings down Rashi. You know, like every sugya he says Rashi translates it. He even brings Rashi's word for word. Like, so I don't know if you could say that it's not based on Rashi.
Rebbe?
Yes.
But you're beginning to sound like Kamala.
What?
I think what you're trying to say is that there is no general rule that we follow Rashi or Tosfos, either as the earlier or the later. It'll vary by case and who quotes whom. Is that what you're saying? Or
No,
is there a general rule that we follow Rashi because he was the older one?
No.
Or we follow Tosfos because they were the later? There is no such rule.
No, the question was, do we even bring Rashi and Tosfos when it comes to Shulchan Aruch? That was the question. Not which one do we follow.
I thought it was, do we generally follow Rashi or Tosfos in an argument?
No, the question was, is it even discussed in the Shulchan Aruch, Rashi or Tosfos? And the reason for such a question is because it's correct that we often just look at the Rush, the Rif, and the Rambam.
But they are quoting.
But really, they're quoting Rashi and Tosfos, and in the Beis Yosef, and then even if they're not discussed, and even if they're not accepted in Shulchan Aruch, if there are cases where there are other Rishonim that argue, often Rashi and Tosfos' view is at some point brought in either to be more strict or more lenient, or in certain scenarios, and so sometimes you could be lenient and rely on Rashi's interpretation, or sometimes you should be more strict and so on.
Isn't the classic case of the tefillin we make a bracha on is the Rashi ones, right?
Right.
So,
right.
So, I mean, you can't get more classic than that.
Yeah. Good point.
I was always taught that you don't paskin it through by Rashi.
I think what you mean is that when someone says that, what they mean is don't learn a Gemara and start making announcements in shul. You know what I mean? The Gemara says you're not allowed to do that. The Rashi says you can't, you have to be careful when you learn Gemara, when you learn Mishnayos, and don't go home and start changing your kitchen rules because you saw a Gemara in Chulin that says this and Rashi translated it that way. So this is allowed. We're allowed to cook in the same oven and the same this, You have to be careful when you learn that not necessarily is it the final verdict, So that's the, not necessarily is, just got to wait till you see how it's broad in Shulchan Aruch. And one of the things also with Shulchan Aruch is a lot of times you got to wait for a few paragraphs later when it then adds an exception to the rule and when it qualifies things, and then it says, and there is another opinion, and it's like the 2 paragraphs later and you almost did something based on what you read first. So that's where you have to be careful not to follow. But very often we do follow Rashi. And then often we follow Tosfos. I mean, they're both very. I don't know numbers. Which one has the percentage? Maybe Google might be able. AI now, you could probably find out what's the majority in Mishnah Berurah's final verdicts. Like Rashi, who wins? How many verdicts? How many cases does he paskin? But definitely there are. These are the main pillars of the explanation of the Gemaras, Rashi and Tosfos. The other Rishonim are as well. But often Rashi and Tosfos are very, very common to be the halacha.
But an explanation of a particular term or what exactly somebody means is not a psak din.
Right. True. In other words, a lot of as we've been seeing, a lot of the halacha sort of it follows a pathway of does an opinion seem to be wrong based on some other Gemara? Does it seem to prove that explanation wrong, or is there a kasha on learning it this way? Or is the majority of the commentaries seem to follow this understanding? So there's the majority, there's the kasha on one way of learning. He ends with a kasha. There are numerous situations where the Shulchan Aruch will paskin one way, and it has to be based on these ideas, and either majority of those three main poskim, or if there's a kasha on one of the shitas, or halacha kebasroi, the halacha follows the final opinion, and that would be if if there was some type of a verdict that was mentioned in one of the later poskim. So there could be that the Shulchan Aruch would paskin that way as well. Okay. Anyway, so we're up to the final little piece over here before the Mishnah. Mu'uba kamin bias. So we've got schach that's thick, like a house. Now, the Mishnah had said this final wording, and Rashi translated it that its schach is very thick. And Mishnah said it's like a house. So the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a brisa. Hamu'ube kamin bias. If the schach is thick, like a house, afal pi, even though that the stars are not visible from within the sukkah, you don't see the stars because it's very thick. Sheira, it's still going to be kosher. Ein koich vechama nirin mitoicha. If the koich vechama, and koich vechama, Rashi says, when the sun shines on it, and you don't see the from within, you don't see that, you don't see the rays of the sun, then this is not similar to a sukkah according to Beis Shammai, and it doesn't look like a sukkah, and therefore Beis Shammai says it's invalid, and Beis Hillel machshirin, and Beis Hillel says it is kosher. So we have a debate over here between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. If not only you don't see the stars from it, but you don't even see the rays of the sun. So in that case, there's an argument if it's going to be kosher. Beis Shammai says it's not kosher. Beis Hillel says it is going to be kosher. And in Shulchan Aruch it brings down, what about if it's so thick that it doesn't even rain through it? So in Shulchan Aruch here, so in that same chapter that we were learning before about the Sukkah Meduvlelas, that same chapter talks about the thick schach. So in Shulchan Aruch, it's chapter 631, paragraph 3. It says that the derech hasikoch liyos kal, the way of the schach is that it should be light, so that you could see the stars, the big stars from it. So again, it's not supposed to be so light that you'll see the small stars, but you should see the big stars from it, from within it. And I'm reading the regular Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Cairo. And if it was thick like a house, even though the Kechavim, the stars, are not seen from it, it's kosher. So what you see in the Shulchan Aruch is that really you should be able to see the big stars. That's lechatchil. And if it's not, then it's still kosher. But it seems like that's the ideal. Derech hasikuch, the way of the schach is that you should be able to see the stars. It's a little vague. It doesn't say it's a mitzvah to be that way. He says the way of the schach is to be kal, to be light. Now in the Mishnah Brura, he says hakechavim hagedolim. So he says the big stars means the stars that are visible even by day. Those are the stars that we're referring to, even before sunset. When you see those stars you should be able to see. Now, the Achronim write, he says, that l'chatchila, we need that even at night, you should see the night stars from within the sukkah. That's the way the Achronim write, the later commentaries in Shulchan Aruch of Code of Law. That and he brings Darkei Moshe brings the Maril that in the Darkei Moshe, which is the Ramah, in his Sefer Darkei Moshe, he writes the name of the Maharil that it's mutter, you're allowed to be masachet, to use thick schach, that you won't see the stars. I'm sorry. Let me read that again. Darkei Moshe, in the name of the Maharil, writes that it's mutter to be masachet av harbe, very thick schach, because it's impossible that you won't see the stars, even though at night you won't see the stars, but during the day there's holes and cracks in many places. So he says that even if you make it pretty thick, it's fine. And then he brings that Sefer Bikurei Yaakov says that a person who's makel, that makes it very thick, a person who relies on this opinion, makes it very thick, is not a problem, especially that that in a case where you're nervous, if you make it too thin, then the wind will blow off the schach and you'll end up that the wind will blow too much and you will be uncomfortable. So better to put more schach than to have it a light schach and you'll be uncomfortable in the sukkah. And what he means uncomfortable is, number one, you'll feel more wind, and number two, you're going to feel the cold. This especially applies in the north, where it's much colder. It's often cold, very cold during sukkahs, or it's getting cold, and so the more schach you put on, the more body heat in the sukkah, and it stays there, and I guess breathing and so on, So it seems like you could be to put on a lot of schach is not a problem. And look in the Pri Megadim that writes Efsher, he says Pri Megadim writes it's possible that in seeing the stars, it's enough, even if you just see in one place. So what he means is that the Pri Megadim writes that this whole concept that you want to see the stars, as long as one place you could see through, that's good enough. Efsher, possibly. He says, now, if it's extremely thick, that the rain can't fall in, so if you have such a if you have an area of 4 handbreadths like that, where that would be called schach puzzle, that would be considered invalid schach, and that would be a problem. So there is a problem if the rain can't fall through. If you remove some of it, he brings down that you don't have to shake everything else, even if you put it on all together, because it's not called really schach puzzle, invalid schach. So if it's really too thick in one area, you could take off some and then it's fine. If the rain wasn't coming through, I wonder how much schach you would need that the rain doesn't fall through. I mean, it's very rare to have so much schach, especially here in Florida where we use these the palm branches with this so much empty space in between. Even if you pile 5 of them on top, which would cost you a lot of money to pile, and you'd need a very heavy sukkah, strong sukkah to handle the weight. But I would think the rain at some point it's not going to block the rain completely from coming through. So anyway, bottom line is that there's definitely leniencies to have a lot of schach as long as the rain can fall through. And then he brings that when he says even if the stars, it's kosher, even though you don't see the stars, it's still going to be kosher. He says not the big ones and not the small ones. You don't see the big ones. And he says the Achronim write that nevertheless, if it's so thick that the rain can't fall through, so even if it's a lot of rain, again, if it's a small amount of rain, it's not a problem. If it's a lot of rain, even a lot of rain doesn't fall through. So if so, it's similar to a house. So he says you should be machmer and consider it puzzle because of the gezerah of a house. Nevertheless, but the evet, if there's no other sukkah, you can't remove some of the schach. So he says you could be makel, you could rely on the lenient views. Yesh lismach al hamachshirin. You could rely on the lenient views. And he says brings this from the Shari Tshuva. And he says, but the Yeved, when you can't take off some of the schach, you could be soimach on the machshirim, be soimach on those that are lenient.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Not my question is not specifically in this case, but in general. The amount of sunlight is that there's no differentiation made, and there should be, I think, between whether the sukkah, whether the sun is going from east to west as opposed from north to south or south to north. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, we sort of touched on that when we spoke about Taisvis, emphasizing that we look at the sun as if it's straight above. And if that's going to give you, when the sun is straight on top of your sukkah, you're going to have majority shade, that's going to be fine. That's the way Taisvis learned it. Rashi seemed to learn that it does apply even from the sides, like you would want that it should be, you should have majority shade even when the sun is on the side. In the way Rashi, however, of course, according to Rashi, you could use the law of Chavoit Rami to make it okay. But it seemed, again, Rashi didn't spell it out so clearly, but that's the seemingly understanding of how he learned the Gemara, was that you do take that into consideration, the fact that the sun is on the side, not necessarily that we just look at the sun when it's only straight above. So it seemed to be an argument with Rashi and Tosfos. And your question would only apply, would be like the question would only apply if you follow Rashi. How do if the sun would be going in this direction, it's not a problem. But if the sun is going in the other direction, it is going to be a problem. It's more sunlight than shade. So would that be a kosher sukkah? And the answer would be, according to Tosfos, yes, it would be kosher, because as long as the schach is straight above, I mean, I'm not exactly sure your scenario, but let's say from above, it's enough schach. But because maybe some of the schach is up and down and it's moving. So therefore you maybe there's more sunlight than shade. So that could be a problem because the sun is coming in from the sides. So according to Tosfos, it's not a problem because we look at the sun from above. According to Rashi, it could be a problem, but probably also not a problem because even if you don't have Chavayt Rami, you have 3 tefachim. You have the law of love. You could it's within 3 tefachim. Abaye's rule. So it would seem like it's not exactly a problem. I guess the only issue would be if you really don't have enough schach and you want to just rely on the fact that the sun is hardly shining because it's hardly hitting your sukkah, so it's more shade than sun. That's not called more shade than sun, just because the sun doesn't shine so much in your area. You know what I mean? That would not be a way for leniency.
My scenario is like if a person has a sukkah like in Crown Heights between 2 buildings,
yeah,
and if the sun is going north to south and south to north, it could be totally under sunlight the whole time. But if it's going east to west and west to east, then it's going to be in the shade much more.
Right. But when it's in the sun, is it enough shade? When it's in the sun, does it give enough shade? That would be the question. If it's not giving enough shade, then it's not kosher. Even when the sun is not up, even at night, even when the sun is on the side. But if it's giving enough shade, so then obviously it's kosher. It's fine. And
so the only way
look
to
at the
judge
sun.
that is, the only way to judge that is when the sun is totally overhead.
It's out. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I get it. Okay.
What time is
Thanks.
lunch?
What time is lunch?
What time is lunch?
Okay. We got 1 minute left. Let's start the next mission. A person builds and makes his sukkah at the top, on top of a agola, on top of a wagon. Lev Moshe, we're on page 22b3 now. We just started the Mishnah.
Okay.
A person makes his sukkah on top of a wagon, or on top of a boat. So he's got the sukkah, he's building the sukkah on a something that's movable. So the Mishnah says, Sheira, it is kosher. V'oilin ba la b'yomtov, and you can go on top of it on yomtov. You can go on top of it. You can be v'oilin la, you can go on top of it. It's on top of a wagon or a boat. You can go on top of it on yomtov. Bereisha Elon, but if you build it on top of a tree, or on top of a camel, kashera, it is kosher. Ve'ein oilin la b'yomtov, you would not be allowed to go up on it on yomtov. And we're going to stop here. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. Zaygus.
Rabbi.
Wait a
Thank you,
minute. How do
Rabbi.
you go on
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
how do you go on a gummel on Yontif?
No, it
I
says you
got a
can't.
picture.
Ain't
Right.
oilin la b'yomtov.
I got a picture for you, Rabbi.
Picture. Picture will
For Shabbos. For Shabbos.
Here you go. 1 second.
Oh,
On top of a camel.
Suck
Wow.
on
Yeah,
top
I
of a
remember
camel.
going on.
That's
I
a
remember
1
going
hump
on-
or a 2 hump? That's a 2 hump.
Yeah, it doesn't look so exciting, actually, that sukkah. Why
If
couldn't they
that's all
build
you
it
got,
straight?
that's all you got.
It's good for
Why didn't-
Kiddush
And why couldn't they build it straight?
because the
Anyway.
camel's not straight.
Yeah.
I'm sure they could figure out a way to
Right.
do it.
Okay.
Anyway, all right. Thank you,
Very
David,
nice.
for the
Shabbat shalom.
presentation.
Thank you,
Have a good
Rabbi.
Shabbos,
Thank you,
everybody.
Rabbi. Good
Yeah,
Shabbos.
thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Shabbos.